Imagine walking the streets of ancient Rome in 67 AD and witnessing a scene that chills you to the bone. The Emperor Nero is in the forum with his new wife, a young woman in silken jewels. But whispers follow them, because everyone knows the terrible truth. The woman by the most powerful man in the world was once a boy named Sporus. What Nero did to him is one of the most disturbing acts of psychological and physical abuse in recorded history. Before we dive into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy uncovering the hidden truths of history, please hit the like button and subscribe for more. Also, let me know where you're listening from in the comments below. It's amazing to me that we can explore these ancient tales together from all over the world, connected by our shared curiosity about the past. This isn't just another story of Roman excess. It's about how absolute power can turn love into obsession, grief into madness, and a person into a living doll created to serve one man's twisted fantasy. You might not know the name Sporus, but his story will stay with you long after you hear it. Let's start with the man who caused this tragedy. Nero wasn't born evil. His early reign was actually quite promising. When he became emperor at just 16, many Romans thought they were entering a golden age. He cut taxes, funded public entertainment, and even performed in plays which the people loved. But absolute power has a way of corrupting even the most promising people. By 65 AD, something in the emperor's mind had fundamentally broken. Maybe it was the constant paranoia that comes with knowing everyone around you wants your position. Maybe it was the loneliness of being the only person in an empire of 60 million who could never be challenged or told they were wrong. Or maybe it was what happened to the one person he claimed to love more than life itself. Her name was Poppaea Sabina, and she was everything Nero thought he wanted in a woman. Incredibly beautiful, intelligent enough to match his own grandiose ideas, and ambitious enough to share his dreams of eternal glory. Poppaea wasn't just a pretty face. Her sharp political instincts made her a powerful ally or a dangerous enemy. When Nero first saw Poppaea, he was already married to Octavia, the previous emperor's daughter. It was a cold, political marriage. Poppaea was everything Octavia was not. Where Octavia was quiet and reserved, Poppaea was vibrant and assertive. Octavia avoided attention, while Poppaea thrived as the center of it. The affair began as a typical Roman scandal, but it quickly turned into something much more dangerous, a genuine obsession. Nero wasn't just attracted to Poppaea's beauty, he was consumed by her in a way that scared his closest advisors. Ancient historians say Nero became increasingly erratic and possessive. He'd fly into a rage if other men even looked at Poppaea for too long. He stationed guards around her at all times, not just for her protection, but to monitor her every move. He showered her with gifts that nearly bankrupted the imperial treasury: jewels from India, silks from China, and perfumes from Arabia. But most tellingly, he began to change reality to fit his obsession. First, he divorced Octavia, a shocking move that alienated many of his supporters. Then, he announced his intention to marry Poppaea in a full imperial ceremony. The wedding was a display of unheard-of luxury, with Nero sparing no expense to show his devotion. Even marriage couldn't satisfy Nero's need to completely own Poppaea. He started to isolate her from her family and friends, surrounding her with people who owed their positions entirely to him. He commissioned dozens of portraits and sculptures of her for his private chambers, so he could see her image even when they were apart. Ancient sources say Nero would sometimes spend hours just watching her go about her day. This wasn't romantic. It was the behavior of a man who had confused love with ownership, who saw another person not as an individual, but as a beautiful object that existed solely for his pleasure. Poppaea, for her part, seemed to understand the dangerous game she was playing. She was smart enough to know that her beauty and Nero's obsession gave her immense power, but also sharp enough to realize this power came with huge risks. She used her influence to advance her family's interests, building a network of supporters who could protect her if Nero's affection ever faded. But Poppaea had one fatal flaw. She wasn't afraid to stand up to Nero. Unlike everyone else in the court who had learned to anticipate his moods, Poppaea kept her independent spirit. She would argue with him about political decisions, criticize his artistic pursuits, and even mock his performances when she thought they were bad. The exact details of what happened on that day in 65 AD differ among ancient historians, but the result is always the same: During what started as a typical argument, some say about Nero coming home late from chariot races, others about his theatrical pursuits, the emperor lost control in a way that would haunt him forever. According to Tacitus, the argument escalated when Poppaea dared to criticize Nero's priorities, suggesting he cared more about his public image than his duties as a husband and father. She was pregnant at the time with their second child, and perhaps the stress made her less willing to tolerate Nero's increasingly erratic behavior. What happened next has been debated for centuries, but the consensus is that Nero, in a fit of rage, either kicked or struck his pregnant wife with such force that she suffered fatal internal injuries. Some sources say it was a single blow to her abdomen. Others describe a sustained attack that left her bleeding and unconscious on the marble floor. Imagine the moment Nero realized what he had done. The man who commanded 30 legions and was worshipped as a god had just destroyed the one thing he actually cared about. The woman he had obsessed over was dying because of his own uncontrolled violence. Ancient sources describe the scene that followed as one of the most pathetic in imperial history. Nero reportedly threw himself on Poppaea's body, begging her forgiveness and commanding her to live, as if his imperial authority could conquer death itself. He called for Rome's best physicians, offering them fortunes to save her life and threatening them with torture if they failed. But it was too late. Poppaea died within hours, taking with her the unborn child who might have been Nero's heir. In that moment, something inside the emperor's mind fundamentally broke. His grief wasn't just emotional devastation, it was a complete break from reality. Nero's mourning became legendary. He refused to have her body cremated, which was the Roman custom. Instead, he had it embalmed and placed in a tomb more elaborate than those of previous emperors. He declared her a goddess, created a cult in her honor, and spent days talking to her corpse as if she could still hear him. The imperial court now had to navigate an even more dangerous environment. Courtiers were expected to pretend that Poppaea was still alive, referring to her in the present tense and leaving her favorite seat empty at banquets. Anyone who suggested the emperor should move on was immediately exiled or worse. It was during this period that Sporus first entered Nero's sight, though the young man had no idea he was walking into a nightmare. Sporus was likely around 14 or 15, born into slavery in the imperial household but freed as a child. He had been raised within the palace walls and was educated for administrative duties. This was a position of relative privilege, as freedmen in imperial service often had better lives than freeborn citizens of lower classes. But this privilege came with total dependence on the emperor's favor. Freedmen owed everything to their former master's generosity, making them incredibly vulnerable. They could rise to great influence but also be discarded, punished, or killed on a whim with no legal protection. What made Sporus special to Nero wasn't his intelligence or skills, it was his face. Multiple ancient sources agree that the young man had an uncanny resemblance to the dead Poppaea, especially around his eyes and delicate bone structure. In a world where Romans believed physical resemblance meant a deeper spiritual connection, this similarity would have seemed almost supernatural. The first time Nero saw Sporus after Poppaea's death, something clicked in the emperor's broken mind. Here was a chance to undo the irreversible, to bring back what he had destroyed. The resemblance was so striking that for a moment, Nero may have actually believed he was seeing Poppaea's spirit returned in a new form. Of course, there was one obvious problem: Sporus was male. But for a man who had convinced himself he was a god, who had spent months talking to a corpse, changing someone's gender seemed like a minor obstacle. What happened next is one of the most calculated acts of cruelty in human history. Nero didn't just decide to force Sporus to dress as a woman, he decided to make the transformation permanent. The emperor summoned Rome's best physicians and ordered them to perform surgery on the young man, just to make him look more feminine. This wasn't just mutilation, it was the systematic destruction of Sporus's identity. The procedure was dangerous, painful, and irreversible, often resulting in death from infection or blood loss. Even if Sporus survived, he would be forever changed physically, emotionally, and socially. He would never be able to have children, have normal relationships, or even be considered fully male by Roman society. The surgery took place in the imperial palace in quarters prepared for the purpose. Ancient surgical procedures were primitive, using basic instruments and crude anesthetics. The process would have been excruciating, lasting for hours with a significant risk of death. A living replica Sporus would have been held down by guards as physicians approached with their instruments, his screams lost on deaf ears. After he recovered, a process that took weeks or months, Nero made a shocking announcement. He was going to marry the young man in a full imperial wedding. The preparations took months and used up immense resources. Sporus was given a new name, Sabina, after the dead empress, and was moved to special quarters to be prepared for his new role. Imperial seamstresses created an entire wardrobe of gowns designed to flatter his modified body and hide any remaining masculine features. Master jewelers crafted ornaments specifically for him, many of which had once belonged to Poppaea herself. These weren't just accessories. They were physical reminders of the woman Sporus was being forced to replace. Makeup artists taught him how to use kohl to make his eyes appear larger, how to apply rouge for rosy cheeks, and how to use powders to soften his facial angles. These lessons were more than just about appearance. They were about the systematic erasure of his original identity. Hairdressers styled his hair in elaborate, fashionable patterns, a process that could take hours daily. But perhaps most psychologically damaging were the lessons in feminine behavior. Sporus was assigned tutors who taught him how to walk, sit, and gesture like a woman. He learned how to hold his hands, position his feet, and move gracefully through a room. Voice coaches worked with him to modify his speech patterns, teaching him to speak in higher tones and adopt feminine mannerisms. This was one of the most difficult aspects, as vocal patterns are deeply ingrained and hard to change. Imagine the psychological torture of this transformation. Every day, Sporus looked in the mirror and saw a stranger wearing his face. Every lesson reminded him that his identity was being erased. Every piece of jewelry that had once belonged to a dead woman was now a shackle, binding him to a role he never chose. The wedding and the aftermath. The wedding was scheduled for the spring of 67 AD, timed to coincide with religious festivals to add ceremonial importance. Nero spared no expense, treating it as a legitimate imperial wedding worthy of the greatest emperor in Roman history. The ceremony took place in the largest palace hall decorated with imported flowers and thousands of oil lamps. Musicians played traditional wedding songs while servants offered fine wines and delicacies. To outside observers, it might have looked like a normal imperial wedding, but those who knew the full story understood they were witnessing something disturbing and unprecedented. The most powerful man in the world publicly marrying a surgically modified teenage boy dressed as his dead wife. The ceremony included all the traditional Roman rituals, the exchange of vows, the joining of hands, the sharing of sacred bread, making the union official. The guests played their parts, offering congratulations and expensive gifts, but the atmosphere must have been thick with barely concealed horror and nervous energy. After the wedding, Nero treated Sporus exactly as he would a legitimate empress. The young man received his own household staff, living quarters in the palace, and an income from the imperial treasury. He had his own litter for travel, and his own retinue of supporters. But this luxury came at a terrible price: the complete erasure of his original identity, and the constant performance of a psychologically devastating role. Sporus was expected to accompany Nero to public functions, sit beside him at state dinners, and act as a devoted wife in all interactions. This wasn't just about appearances. Nero genuinely seemed to believe he had successfully brought Poppaea back to life. He would call Sporus by his dead wife's name, reminisce about shared memories that never happened, and expect responses that kept up the elaborate fiction. For Sporus, every day became a high-stakes performance, where the slightest mistake could mean death. He had to remember not only how to look and act like a woman, but how to respond as if he were Poppaea herself. When Nero mentioned past events from his marriage, Sporus had to react as if he remembered them personally. Ancient sources say Sporus became incredibly skilled at this deception, developing an almost supernatural ability to anticipate Nero's moods and respond appropriately. But they also note he grew more withdrawn and melancholic as time went on, even as he continued to play his assigned role perfectly in public. The psychological strain is almost impossible to imagine. Or over 2 years, Sporus lived this bizarre existence. His ordeal reached new heights when Nero decided to tour Greece. The emperor, who saw himself as a great artist, was eager to compete in Greek festivals. Naturally, Sporus accompanied him, displayed to foreign dignitaries as the Empress of Rome. Imagine Greek aristocrats trying to make sense of their conqueror, traveling with a teenage boy dressed as a woman, demanding that everyone treat this obvious fiction as reality. By 68 AD, Nero's excesses had finally pushed the Roman establishment too far. Rebellions broke out across the empire, led by governors tired of his erratic behavior. The Praetorian Guard declared their opposition to his rule, and the Senate condemned him as an enemy of the state. When Nero fled Rome with a small group of supporters, Sporus was among them. Even while facing death, the emperor couldn't leave behind his living reminder of Poppaea. They holed up in a villa outside Rome, where Nero alternated between planning grandiose escapes and preparing for a theatrical suicide. When he learned his enemies were closing in, Nero chose death over capture. Nero's suicide left Sporus incredibly vulnerable. He was one of the most visible symbols of the emperor's reign, both a valuable prize and a dangerous liability for whoever seized power next. What followed was perhaps even more tragic. Sporus became a political pawn, passed from one powerful man to another like valuable property. He was claimed by Nymphidius Sabinus, then Otho, then Vitellius, each treating him much as Nero had, keeping him dressed as a woman and calling him by Poppaea's name. It was under Vitellius that Sporus's nightmare reached its ultimate conclusion. The new emperor decided to use him for public entertainment in the Colosseum, specifically in a reenactment of mythological scenes involving sexual humiliation. Rather than submit to this final degradation, Sporus made the only choice that was truly his own in years. He took his own life, likely by poison, in 69 AD. He was probably no more than 20 years old. In death, Sporus finally escaped the grotesque theater that had consumed his life. His story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of absolute power and the human cost of imperial excess. What makes his story so haunting isn't just the abuse he endured, but how he was systematically stripped of his identity and agency. From the moment Nero decided he resembled Poppaea, Sporus ceased to exist as an individual and became a canvas for the emperor's twisted fantasies. The fact that Sporus chose death over further humiliation suggests that somewhere beneath the layers of forced femininity and imperial conditioning, a spark of his original self survived. His suicide was both a tragedy and a final act of defiance, a refusal to be degraded further, even at the cost of his life. Perhaps most tragically, we know almost nothing about who Sporus was before his transformation. What were his hopes and dreams? All of that was erased when he became Nero's living doll. His story deserves to be remembered not just as a strange curiosity from ancient Rome, but as a testament to both human cruelty and human resilience. By choosing his own death, Sporus reclaimed the one thing that had been denied to him throughout his adult life: the power to make his own choice about his fate.